May I now request Dr. Swarnim Wagle, Chair, the Institute of Integrated Development Studies, IIDS, Kathmandu, Nepal, to present on his topic. Dr. Wagle, please.
The Honorable Foreign Minister, Dr. A.K. Abdul Momen, Major General Habib Uddin, Ambassador Ghanshyam Bhandari, and Ambassador Masfi Binte Shams, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor for me to speak here today on this special occasion. And as a student of development economics, it's been a real privilege to watch the agenda of mass social advancement that has been pioneered here in Bangladesh and which is now nicely dovetailed and is propelling the economic rise of Bangladesh. I think when the economic textbooks will be written in the future, this story of social progress predating or setting the stage for economic rise of developing countries, I think Bangladesh will feature on the forefront. The story is, of course, very inspirational. Aspects of your rise to many lagging South Asian countries and LDCs, least developed countries like Nepal. It's also a pleasure to acknowledge, as the ambassador has just done, the wonderful relationship that exists between Bangladesh and Nepal. We were one of the earliest countries to recognize Bangladesh in 1972, and the challenge and duty of our generation of citizens is to build on this beautiful legacy, to imagine a shared future of peace and prosperity. Now, General Habibuddin and Ambassador Bhandari have already covered many issues, so they've made my job easier as well as harder. But let me try and focus on a few issues that I think they are not novel in the sense that you haven't heard these before, but need to be reinforced and perhaps reorient aspects of our partnership along those lines. But the central question, as I was flying into Dhaka yesterday, I was thinking, in the COVID context, we're talking about a development strategy that is China +1, right? When you focus, when you invest, when you trade just with a narrow set of countries at an extraordinary time like the COVID pandemic or many unforeseen, unpredictable crises in the future, there are risks. And so similar to that, drawing on that analogy, I was thinking, what would it take for Nepal and Bangladesh to become each other's +1? Right? And to be more specific in the South Asian context, India +1. So India is exceptionally important to Bangladesh as a neighbor, as a regional power. India remains exceptionally important to Nepal. But India +1 strategy for Nepal and India +1 strategy for Bangladesh, I think there's a space that we need to carve for each other. And therein lies tapping all the latent potentials that the two distinguished speakers have already talked about. I've been coming and going from Bangladesh since 2003, a lot of the LDC-related conferences, my own work as a trade economist in the 2000s related to the WTO rounds, etc. Very vibrant discussions that used to happen, Bangladesh used to host, of relevance to all the LDCs and the lagging South Asian countries. So a theme that I think remains a low-hanging fruit is indeed sub-regional trade and development cooperation. Through bilateral, the BBIN architecture that we're building, and the regional, well-established regional organizations like SAARC, as well as BIMSTEC. There's a certain, when you talk about India as a regional power, there is the obvious asymmetry. A lot of these smaller neighbors get very anxious when you take India as a complete bloc. What appealed to me when BBIN came into vogue in the development discourse is it set the stage for greater symmetry and reciprocity with the economic subunit of northeast of India as the linchpin. So Bhutan, Nepal, the northeast plus West Bengal and the state of Bangladesh, there's a certain symmetry that one can expect, which the overwhelming overall entirety of the Indian subcontinent can be set aside. It is also attractive as a development economist to me to see that when the full-fledged regional cooperation through the aegis of SAARC or even BIMSTEC is not immediately possible, we tend to opt for second best recourses. And I think BBIN also offers that. The third important thing here is that this region, this sub-region, can be the gateway to Southeast Asia, a much more dynamic sub-region of the Asian continent. And a proactive BBIN agenda, I think, that lowers trade costs, boosts firm competitiveness at home, broadens the tradability of services, especially in energy and tourism, invests in physical infrastructure to connect our major centers of commerce, and that aids people-to-people mobility is really the agenda that we should be working on. Now, I had the good fortune in my earlier incarnation as a researcher, as a senior economist at the World Bank, we actually, rather than talking about the macro topics, really dive deep into a common area that India, Nepal, and Bangladesh share. So we looked at price, employment, and production data. This is a 2014 paper that you can actually Google and download. It came out of the World Bank. So we took the two Nepali districts of Jhapa and Ilam, tea producing districts on our eastern border. We looked at Darjeeling and Uttar Dinajpur in India, and we looked at Bangladesh's Panchagad district. So we're trying to explore, is there a trade complementarity? If the current thickness of borders can be thinned or reduced, all the man-made or policy-induced barriers can be lessened, what can happen in an ideal scenario? And we came up with some fascinating numbers and projections. So complementarity between the Nepalese districts, Ilam and Jhapa, and the Indian district is lower than that between the Panchagad district of Bangladesh and the Indian districts of Darjeeling and Uttar Dinajpur. And this was through the product of rice, right? One is a consumer, one is a producer. And had the borders been more fluid, I think the consumers would have benefited a lot. Now, in our case, in the Nepal and India, there was some discussion on tea, on milk and meat and potato, and we're also tracking how the prices differed on each of these consumer items. So there's a significant price wedge we found between Nepali and Indian districts of up to 50% and up to 90% between Indian and Bangladeshi districts. And these wedges can indeed be thinned with policy, with infrastructure, and with the firm's enhancement of firms' productive capacity. So this is where the discussion around PTAs, the preferential trade agreements, comes into the fore. What can we do to give it a nudge, right? To these formal arrangements, to these legal architectures, to give that certainty to exporters and importers, the predictability of trade practices that an PTA enshrines would indeed be a way forward. Now, I do recognize Bangladesh was fortunate, even as an LDC, it became a default member of the WTO. Countries like Nepal and Cambodia have had to negotiate their accession into the WTO. And I remember in 2003, 2004, a lot of the tariffs we were required to lower by a vast margin. There's something called ODCs, other duties and charges, that Nepal was required to almost eliminate or eliminate with a time-bound schedule. But Bangladesh, having been an original WTO member, going back to its original membership of GATT as part of British India, actually, inherited many of that, the heavy margin on tariffs as well as ODCs. So I believe, it is politically sensitive when you undertake tariff and trade reforms, liberalization reforms. So a pragmatic way forward. We see the potentials. The two earlier speakers have already highlighted it. I think it would be wonderful to start with an early harvest scheme on the PTA. So identify those win-win products. It could be citrus fruits. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina herself took an interest in the import of yarn from Nepal, as the ambassador just said. So let's identify those 8 to 10 products, both on the Bangladeshi side and Nepali side. So before undertaking a full-blown PTA, we can perhaps start with an early harvest scheme that instills confidence, that assures traders and industries that are often clamoring for domestic protection, right? So I think that might be a way forward. At the same time, we reduce these policy-induced barriers through these preferential trade arrangements. I think investment in connectivity to cut costs, to spur growth, and to first foster externalities is extremely important. We in Nepal are unfortunately landlocked, and it's a particular, very distinct development predicament. It is well known in the literature that if neighbors grow by 1%, economic growth is 1% in your contiguous regions, neighbors tend to grow by about 0.4%. But for landlocked countries like us, that ratio is almost 0.7%. So if neighbors' transit infrastructure improves from about 25th percentile to 75th percentile, almost half of that structural handicap associated with landlockedness just disappears. So therein lies the mathematical or the economic justification for much enhanced connectivity. Issues have been talked about. We were separated by a very, very tiny strip of land. And this is where I think our role of our bigger neighbor, India, becomes indispensable. Now, it is actually well acknowledged that bigger countries are often wary of smaller neighbors getting together and ganging up against the bigger power. This is not just true for India. It also applies to the former Soviet Union or Russia. The United States, obviously, during the Cold War years, it encouraged multilateralism, boosted multilateral institutions, etc. But after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, it tended to go bilateral. And that you see, that parallel you see, this is a phenomenon associated with all rising powers, all big powers. So India, too, is very comfortable dealing with its neighbors on a one-on-one basis, on a bilateral basis. For it, sub-regionalism is an amalgamation of all these bilateral arrangements. Smaller countries, economically speaking, Nepal and Bangladesh, it's a different issue. We see sub-regionalism and regionalism as a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. And this sort of divergent preference on the part of smaller and bigger countries in our region needs to be reconciled. And how do we do that? I think the issue of trust becomes exceptionally important here. And trust begins through those early harvest schemes, through those low-hanging fruits, literally, with the case of citrus fruits that we can export from Nepal to Bangladesh. But the example of yarn that was already shared, digitalization. Sometimes when my driver doesn't show up, I use Pathao in Kathmandu. And it's just taken the city by storm. It's become instantly popular. And I might note it's a Bangladeshi export, obviously. So it's these small gestures, because the volumes that we're talking about on trade is actually embarrassingly low. And we have to do better. We must do better and really begin with that homework to ease these constraints, both man-made, policy-induced, and the geographical and the geopolitical constraints that we are well aware of. The second theme that I wanted to reinforce is, again, on the issue of clean energy. The previous speakers have already spoken on this, climate change, and the governance of regional commons. And this is where I think the climate change ties our fate together. The Himalayan glaciers are melting. The glacial lakes in the Himalayas pose immense threat to downstream settlements. There's the flooding, the weather patterns becoming erratic, the heat stress on labor productivity, health, crops, livestock, all this emerging evidence associated with climate change. I think fates of Bengali societies and Nepali societies are intricately linked. And the Himalayas are home to 10 major river systems of the world, both on the northern side and on the southern side, that support the livelihoods of almost 2 billion people. And we in Nepal are particularly vulnerable because of this elevation-dependent warming. If the rest of the world, the global temperature is rising by 1.5, you need to add another 0.3 degrees Celsius because of this phenomenon. And your riverine landscape, dozens of international rivers flowing through Bangladesh. I think this is all intricately linked. And so this is where the importance of cooling the climate, or at least stemming the warming of the planet, and moving to the non-carbon sources of energy becomes very, very important if we are to power growth and see tens of billions of our people aspiring to high middle income status. Now, every theory, every conceivable theory of how to hit net zero by 2050, which is a date that many countries have opted for, looks like this. You have to make electricity clean. You make much more clean electricity, and you make almost everything run on electricity. Let me say that again. Every theory of how to hit net zero by 2050 looks like this. You make electricity sources clean. You make much more electricity, much more clean electricity, and you make almost everything that we consume and use run on electricity. That's the magic formula. And herein lies, given Bangladesh's aspirations to become a high-income society over the next 20, 30 years, and Nepal's resources, especially on clean energy, there's a vast potential to trade and do joint collaboration. And there's been enough or abundant discussion around this topic. I remember Ambassador Masfi Bentosans, when she was in Nepal, took great interest in this. And I understand from the ambassador to Bangladesh, the Nepali ambassador to Bangladesh, that there are 3 projects where there might be potential. Again, thinking in terms of that low-hanging fruit or that early harvest. Just recently, a few months ago, the power secretaries of both countries have agreed to import about 50 megawatts of clean energy from Nepal. But this needs, given Nepal and Bangladesh are not contiguous, the cooperation of India, and India itself is also very positive on this. There's this big hydro project, Sunkoshi 3rd, 683 megawatt Sunkoshi project, which could be jointly undertaken. And a preliminary environmental assessment has been undertaken on this. And something that I facilitated when I was in government in 2014, the Upper Karnali hydro project, 900 megawatts, initially destined for export to India. The developer, the GMR, has been negotiating with its Bangladeshi clients to export more than 50% of that energy to Bangladesh. I hope we make fast progress on these issues so that it sets a precedence for much more deeper cooperation in these areas. There's a parallel forum that I'm affiliated with. It's convened by the World Bank on the power secretaries, sort of informal track 2 kind of modalities. There too, we've been looking at hindrances and nudging, particularly our Indian friends, to allow Bhutanese, Nepali clean energy to flow into neighboring countries where there's massive demand, and eventually think of a sub-regional electricity grid. So this is a highly promising area because we need clean energy to power our growth aspirations, but it is also becoming now indispensable to solve or do our part to combat climate change and address this challenge of our regional commons. The final point, which the previous speakers have already spoken on, and let me just reinforce, the exercise of soft power through people-to-people links. So tourism, obviously, again, vastly undertapped. You are a country of 170 million. I checked that close to 3 million Bangladeshis travel abroad as outgoing tourists. And again, only 20,000 of Bangladeshis from such a populous country visit Nepal, which is beautiful, which is cool. So when you need to run away from the heat in the summer, I think the cool hill stations of Nepal are there to welcome you. And we see tourism, especially ecotourism, as one of our sources, like clean energy, a source of our future development milestone. And we would like to do much more in this area. The connectivity, which is much more frequent than what I used to see in the past, through Himalayan Airlines and Biman, flying much more regularly now is a start. But if we can operationalize the motor vehicles agreement, and maybe again, look at that, carve out that early harvest there through passenger traffic. So if the cargo traffic is engendering some anxiety on the smaller neighbors like Bhutan and Nepal, why don't we start with the passenger vehicle movement? And Bangladesh is driving into Nepal quite easily, and Nepal is also coming down to Bangladesh. That reciprocity would, I think, set the stage for larger volumes of inbound and outbound tourist flows. Academic exchange, which is, again, so many of my friends were trained in Bangladesh. very competent medical doctors now, professionals. I think that is ongoing. We can deepen that perhaps. Cultural exchange is happening, but we could do a lot more there. And the civil society track too is, I must note, as somebody who is part of this ecosystem, is exceptionally vibrant. So think tanks like my own, IIDS, SOTI from the Nepali side, and think tanks like BIISS and CPD and BIDS, it's a long association that we've been having. And this process is actually often gets sidelined in terms of official discourses, but it does a lot to tie researchers, academics, and advocates to work together on common issues. And there are plenty of common issues that we need to work on going forward. LDC graduation is one. We have a common date, November 2026, when both Bangladesh and Nepal are seeking to graduate out of LDC status. There are anxieties again on both sides. There are lobbies on your side as well as in our country to really look into this deeply. And this is where I think shared experiences on the policy minutiae of these complicated issues would go a long way in allaying fears, but also looking at the new opportunities that might come as we cross this development threshold. SAARC headquarters is based in Kathmandu. There's a lot that we can do. Indeed, many people recognize that this was a Bangladeshi and a Nepali sort of initiative. And there's a lot that ought to be done. Headquarters is here in Dhaka. And so there's a lot that we could do on the regional organization front. So let me end by returning to my earlier question. What would it take for Nepal and Bangladesh to become each other's +1 in South Asia? That's the key question. And the three sets of issues that I highlighted on trade and economic cooperation, development cooperation, on the climate change and clean energy, and the exercise of soft power through deeper people-to-people ties. I think therein lies and the answer, or a set of answers or sequence of answers. And so building on this stable and mutually respectful relationship of 50 years, here's to imagining a Bangla-Nepali vision of shared peace, progress, and prosperity for our generation, for the next 50 years. Thank you very much.